So in relationships that matter, especially our relationship with God, especially our relationship with our loved ones, we have to lean into the scary. The fear is not because it's something that we need to protect ourselves from. The fear is because it's unfamiliar and we need to learn to make it familiar. So that's what I've done is I've made vulnerability familiar. So there's nothing that anyone has seen of me that is worth anything that didn't start from me having to first be vulnerable somewhere,
Mm.
somehow.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Called Forth. I'm Dawn Town, author, speaker, and podcast host. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Called Forth podcast. I am absolutely thrilled to have my guest on today's episode. I'm going to give her a formal introduction, but her informal introduction is she's an amazing dear friend. She's been my coach several years ago, and I'm just so excited to have her on. She is an entrepreneur, a speaker, author, a leader. She's a wife and a mom of three, all the things. And she really has devoted her life to empowering other people and helping them walk into their God given purpose. So, thank you so much, Dr. Marie Cochran, for being on this episode of the Called Forth podcast.
Yes, thank you so much, Dawn, for having me. And I love that intro. It's down to earth. It's in the weeds of who I really am and how I really want to show up. So I love it. And I love our friendship and just being able to see, how you've blossomed and bloomed into yourself. And I'm so excited to be on here with you.
Oh, well, thank you. So, I obviously know your background and your story, but I know for a lot of people listening, this is their first time being introduced to you. So, I'd love for you to just take us back to introducing more about who you are, where you've come from, and about your story.
Yes. Okay. So who are they listening to? They are listening to Marie Cochran, who has studied Christian psychotherapy. So I have a doctorate in that. I'm also I guess a minister, you would say. I'm a reverend. So my title is Reverend Doctor of Christian psychotherapy. I'm a chaplain. I'm an unofficial doula, getting my credentials soon because I absolutely love helping women labor and get
Mm.
to the other side of a hard process and to their baby and actually going back to I guess schooling. That's what I wanted to go to school for, was to be an OBGYN, but God kind of shifted my path and showed me that he wasn't calling me to help women deliver their babies. It was to help them deliver their dreams, right? So
Mm.
that's what led to where I am now as a Christian psychotherapist, or that's what I practice, right, in my coaching practice. But that's what it all started with, is helping women get through the hard. And God has used me, thankfully, to help many people in life in different areas of their life as it pertains to marriage, as it pertains to parenting. That's at my heart, as it pertains to our own minds and where we're going through and what we're, working through in ourselves. Those are the areas that I'm super passionate about. Leadership is something that leaders specifically is where God has really drawn me, because my mother, she was my very first client. That's how I knew the gift was even there, because she is a missionary in Haiti, pastor, has planted several church all around Haiti, and we moved to Haiti to be with her. But um she didn't have a safe space. She didn't have a space for where she could just be herself. And for God would have it that she would call me. So at this point in life, I was here, like, between I was in college, actually, because I started with a pre-med degree. But we would talk, like, when she's calling me, she's telling me about all of her problems and things like that, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I'm really qualified to even talk to you. I'm your daughter, what I'm saying? Like, what can I really say about what you're
Mm.
going through? But I was her safe space, and that wasn't something that I did start, like, learning about it, and learning different skill sets and building up my toolbox. At that point, I remember my first class was an intrinsic coaching class
Mm.
that I took in school. But it was almost like a grooming that was happening without me really realizing it, right? What was going on. But it was a grooming that was happening to set me up to support my mom and just be the space that she needed so that if she needed to cry, if she needed to just feel like she didn't have it together, she had the space to do that. And God showed me that it wasn't anything, it wasn't my experience in her different areas or what she was going through specifically that I needed. It was just the tools to be able to create and hold a space and then allow her to bring out what God had already put inside of her, the solutions, right? The
Mm,
Holy Spirit that's inside of her, just helping her kind of manage her emotions and put them into check so that she could get clear, right, on what she needed. So of course I diverted into more of what I do instead of what I what's who I am. But I have 3 children. I've been married 17 and a half years now.
mm,
Oldest is 15, youngest is 11. I've homeschooled for quite a bit. We live in Jacksonville, Florida. My husband was former military. I've been an entrepreneur since I was 17 years old. Yeah, so I'm all the things. I'm all the things. Hey, I do a lot of things. I love what I do. I love my lifestyle, to be honest.
mm,
God has really put me in a place where as much as ambitious as I am, right? Being an entrepreneur since I was 17 years old. My parents were in Haiti. We lived in Haiti as missionaries from 12 to about 15. And then at about 15, 16, I was kind of on my own with my sister, who's right under me. She's 13 months younger than me. And we were kind of on our own around 16, graduating and stuff like that, living with family and things like that. Because my parents were in Haiti. So that was like when the, I guess, ambition kind of sparked in my life. Like, you need to figure
mm,
this out. And it was good
mm,
for me. I figured it out, right? And then I gave my life to Christ initially personally when I was about 18, 19. And
mm,
that's when it was personal. I had originally gotten baptized when I was 12, but my parents are pastors. So you know how it is. I'm a pastor's daughter, you know.
mhm,
Not to say that at 12 years old it was like a push. Someone told me to go up there and give my life, but it was more of, all right, he's making an altar call, it's the right thing to do type of thing, moment in my life
mm,
at 12 years old. And then, but at 19, it was a personal walk. It was just me and God. And I was, talking to my husband at the time. Well, I think it must have been 18 because we weren't quite married yet, but we were engaged. And it just became personal. My relationship and my walk with him became personal, and he's just unpacked my life over the past 20 years almost now from that
mm,
time when I gave him my heart to who I am today. And that's just someone who's constantly at his feet looking for what he wants out of me
mm.
and staying surrendered. So hopefully that helps. If there's something they need to know, Don, you asked me the question to make sure they know what they need to know.
Yeah, no, I love that. It just reminded me, when you said setup about how often we go through things and we're like questioning God, how are we going to use this? How are we going to use that? But it sounds like as you're sharing, your background and where you've come from, that there was these setup moments that God was using. He was cultivating that season with your mom where you were holding that space for her. And
Mhm.
then lo and behold, you're a coach, you're holding space for people like for years on end. So I love in what you share that God just sets us up whether we know it or not, and he's
Right.
using everything we walk through for our good and for our benefit. So, no, I appreciate the scope of what you share because that helps us to paint a picture of
Yes.
where you come from.
And I want it to be real. I think a lot of times, people share the things that make us say, ooh, about them, where we've traveled and how many people we've spoken into and, companies or whatever that we've shared. And all of that is awesome. But what I do for people is sit with them, right? And
Mm,
oftentimes, it's getting naked with them. And when you're naked, none of that matters. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
none of the titles, and you just want to feel safe. And that's
yeah.
at the core of it. The things that I've done God uses my experience in these things so that I can relate better to people. And the studies that I've done and the training that I've gotten, it's equipped my gift, right? It's supported and built me up. But, anyone listening to this that's going to get any value from this podcast, I want them to know that, and I hope that I can even help them be vulnerable, because we need more of it. We need the places that I've seen my gift show up best is with my children and with my husband,
Mm,
right? And with my own walk with God. And so I want to be a part of helping other people know what it's like to hold a vulnerable space or a safe space for themselves, and then be able to hold that safe space for other people, because that's like what my revival looks like. Like the revival that
mhm.
I want to be a part of is helping people do that more authentically and lean into that so that we can grow, because there aren't enough coaches, there aren't enough hours in the world for us to be able to get a coach, everyone get a coach. But if we're practiced in
Mm.
this skill set, then we'll be able to be the catalyst of change starting in our homes and beyond.
Yeah, I love that you referenced that because, that you said that you've seen your gift show up the most in your own home with your own family because, you know, you don't want yes, you can show up in the world and show up in all these ways, but if you're not even able to utilize those skills in your own home, then it's just, that's the one place where you want to be able to pour out the most deeply, the most intimately, the most genuinely. So I love that you shared that because that's powerful because I think especially as purpose driven or ambitious people, it's easy to always be looking on the outside of our home, going here, doing this, doing that, building the platform, like all of the things all the
Right.
while we have our own personal audience that God has given us that we
Right.
wanna pour the most deeply into. So I think that just brings it back home at the heart level to what we truly want, which is to
Absolutely.
connect in our own home.
And it puts things in priority, like I think as leaders we have to prioritize, right? We have to master that, right? Because we can be pulled on in so many different ways. But if you can get it right at home with the people that
Mm,
you should be spending the most time with, the people that you should have the greatest connection with, how much more effective will you be when you're meeting a stranger and be able to immediately get to their heart and allow them, and hold the space that you're called to hold in their life in that moment. So I think
true.
that God, otherwise it's more like, oh, I would love to do all these things, but I've got a family and they're a burden, but that's not
Mm,
God. I believe that God is smart enough, right? To like not put a obstacle in the way of the purpose he wants us to bring out. So if my family is not a burden to my call in life, then there must be an asset to it.
mm,
There must be an opportunity, right? So that's
that's
what I
good.
use first. That's what I use first. That's where I want to train first. So that then even when I'm walking out and doing the things that I do, they're even looking at me and like, oh yeah, mom did that with me last night. Or you know what I'm saying? Or
Mm,
oh yeah, we did that for Jasmine last week. And they can participate, and even the legacy as a leader, if you're doing all the things, like at what point are you living your dream, or you're being used by God and then it just dies? You see what I'm saying?
mm,
Like, but if you're
right.
you're committed and you know working that out in your family, if you're living it, then it automatically lives on in them, even if it may not look the same because they have their life and got their own call on their life, whatever that may be. But there's going to be certain deposits that you made in their life that people will see my children or prayerfully my grandchildren and be able to say, oh, Marie Cochran's your grandmother. You know what I'm saying? Or
Yeah.
that's a Marie Cochran question there, or whatever it is, because it's something that continued on in our legacy that we practice. So that's what I
Mm,
think is
that's
so
so good.
important for us to, whatever our situation is, family, relationships, even personal things that we're going through in our lives. Let's lean into those because something tells me that God is so intentional that there's probably a nugget in whatever we're
Mm.
going through that's going to serve us for how we're called to show up.
That's so good. That is keeping things in perspective, taking a step back from the grind of the day to day and really realizing the bigger picture and being intentional with our mindset because it's easy to kind of get lost in the day to day with the family and the things that you're going through and
Yeah.
all of that. But then to just pull back and really think about the value of what you're leaving your kids through, how you're showing up in your day to day, which is so powerful. So that kind of leads me into the next question I want to go into with you. I have seen you in my own life as well as friends of ours really
Mhm,
speak into hard moments. And I would
mhm,
love for you to talk about how you've cultivated that skill in your life because, like I said, in my life, you were able to speak into a hard moment. As you were referencing before, you were a safe place in a season of my life. You were a safe place. And I was really able to fully open up with you because I felt no judgment. I just
mhm,
felt like you got it and you understood. And I think that's important. Um, when you're holding space for people, for them to feel like you get it, you understand. You don't have to have lived it, you don't have to have approved of whatever they did,
right, right,
but
right,
just that
right.
that you get how they got there and there's no judgment in that getting
Yeah.
how they got there scenario. And I saw you do this in person just from the outside looking in several months ago. And you
Mhm,
spoke into a really hard moment. And so I'd really love to talk about how you've been able to do that because that's a real skill set when you've got something intense going on to be able
mm,
to step in a way that brings empowerment and reframing and helps the person see beyond the moment that they're in.
mhm. So I think it helps to start with where I was, right? So there was a season in my life where I lived hard moments and I didn't have a voice in those hard moments. So whatever the trauma was or whatever the thing that was happening, it was more like I was trained to let it happen, take it like a big girl,
Mm,
and move on, right? Don't say anything, don't advocate for yourself. That's not your place. This is just who you are. This is just your portion in life. And if it doesn't kill you, it'll make you stronger, right?
mm,
But I realized that it didn't make me stronger. It made me upset. And so I carried a lot of anger when I was younger. And I was very easily offended when I was younger at a very young age. And from the outside, you wouldn't know it, but those that were closest to me knew that I was very passive aggressive. And a lot of times I wouldn't hurt the other person, but I'd hurt myself in
mm,
how I talked about myself. And it wasn't physical hurting myself, right? Like we would think of the word, but it was the self-sabotage. It was, working yourself into, even like my work ethic that the world may look at and see was, wow, she's such a go-getter and she's so driven and all of these things. But I remember as a college student, I used to do hair at the time. So I would have clients come to my dorm and I would do it. I would like push myself so hard that my hands would swell and I
mm,
would have my appointments stacked like no more than 30 minutes in between each other. And I'd have to sleep with my hands like in a bucket of ice water because I
mm,
had an appointment in 4 to 6 hours coming up and I'm just quickly trying to band-aid for the next thing. Like I had a very low self-esteem and I
mm,
didn't value myself enough to care for me. It was always just give everything you have for everyone else. That's where my value, and that's not healthy, right? That heart
mm.
seems, that martyr mindset seems, wow, like, noble, but it's not. It's not healthy because Jesus was the one who was able to die on the cross and come back to life. He didn't call us to do that, right? So it was very unhealthy. And it wasn't until um I gave my life to Christ, because I had other things that I struggled with, um with my low self-esteem growing up. But around 18, 19, I gave my life to Christ, and I truly decided at that moment to abandon. Not that I did it instantaneously, but the mindset was seated then that I was going to abandon my way of
Mm,
self-soothing, of, you know, um, preservation, self-preservation, or sabotage. I wanted to abandon it for what I felt like God could do. I wanted to make that
mm,
exchange. It's an exchange that needed to happen. And I
mm,
wanted to make that exchange, right? And so I started that process when I made that commitment initially to God. And it was over the years, right? Where, like I shared with you, I was able to hold that safe space for my mom. And then even at that age, when, like, I think I saw my first birth at 16, that's when, and I had always wanted to be an OBGYN, but I started like watching births at like 16. It was my aunt who was having a baby. And then, so I was right there with her, working through her pain, watching someone in their raw, real pain, and just being
mm,
a part of helping them get to the other side of it. Right. And so I kept doing that. I probably have about 17 births under my belt at this point. Right. Because that was something
mm.
I was actively pursuing. But then when God shifted that for me at around 20, let's see, I started having my babies at 23. So around that time, things started shifting for me. And I met Jody, who introduced us, right? We were part of a company
Yeah.
together, network marketing company together. And and we had this prayer group. And so it was then a collective of women who were praying together, sharing vulnerable things, right? And then we would pray it out and hold space for God to work through in our lives. And I watched that happen, right?
Mm,
So, and I saw how God came through for them and for us. And still, even now, I'm like, oh my gosh, we've been together now for, so many years, and we can look back and think back on our vulnerable moments that we were praying together, and see now that God came through, and he answered our prayers, and he healed us and birthed different things out of us, right? And so, um, you know, studying, then I went to school with the John Maxwell program, got my certification with them, and then God opened up the doors for me to get my doctorate. And of course, throughout that time, I'm always like learning, reading books, because it's just something, the mind is something that I'm passionate about. And then, just learning about behavior, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy is something that I believe helps the spiritual, because you can, prayer and seeking God is so, so important. It's everything. Reading the Bible, studying, getting to know who he is. You can't
mm,
really understand how to walk through this life very effectively if you don't know God's character, because a lot of things that happen in life, that's what you're going to weigh it by, to see who is the author, who is the
mm.
one, who is the director of this particular scene, who's producing right, this movie. Does it look like God, or does it look like the enemy, right? Is it deception? And you can only decipher that if you know who God is. And you're going to know who he is by personal relationship, prayer, and worship, and, seeking him and studying the word, so that even in the stories, like, Holy Spirit can reveal to you his true character, so that you can be like, okay, this aligns, this looks like him, or no, this is not him. And you can stand confidently in that. So, you know those, I guess, sharing those stories, summarizing it, that's how I got here. It's through, praying and fasting, and holding vulnerable spaces for other people, and holding them for myself too. I practice vulnerability a lot,
Mm,
so that I know that it's okay, it's safe to do, because that's what I'm asking other people to do. Whenever I sit with someone, I don't straight out say, I want you to be vulnerable with me and tell me everything, but that's the spirit, that's the space that I'm called to hold. So they have to be able to sense it in me. right?
Mm,
And because I live in vulnerability when it comes to with my children or with my husband or with my own walk with God, because there's so many things that I, as Christians, okay, we that's what we're supposed to be doing, is being extremely vulnerable with God. Like,
mm,
my life is not my own. I surrender to you. I consecrate myself to you. That is a very vulnerable position to be in. If we're
mm,
truly walking that out, if we're truly like committing to that for real. It's very vulnerable, and I live there, Don. I live
mm,
at that place where, like, if you go to my church and you ask people, like, what is it like to be a fly on the wall when Marie's in church? She's at the altar weeping, she's at her seat weeping, she's on the floor weeping, because there's a lot that I can do in myself, but I choose to surrender it for God's will and his way instead. So that makes it that my life, I feel like my back is is just open, right? You like the door. My
mm,
husband hates, he doesn't like sitting with the door behind him. He always wants to see the door,
mm,
right? Ex-cop, veteran, whatever. So that's his
mhm,
mindset. But that's how I live. I live like my door's behind me right now. And that's how when you're in a relationship with God, that's what he wants. He wants you
mm,
to have that much faith in him. And so I live that way. And so I think that I can I know that I can communicate with people to be okay with being vulnerable because I know it's okay. I can
mm,
communicate that with you. So when we sit together, it's safe with me because I've been there, I go through it, and I know ultimately I'm safe with God. And that's who I lead people to in that
mm,
moment when we're talking, when we're discussing. I'm going to lead you to God because He's going to be the one who's going to be there forever. You may have me for an hour or two, or my children, yes, they have me for longer, but anything could happen at any given time. So
mm.
I want them to ultimately have that relationship with God and not me, so that if I'm gone, then they're not left alone, right? So that's the I guess that's the long and short of it.
No, I appreciate that so much. What came to mind as you were sharing is that your being informs your doing, like who you are. You're bringing who you are to the table, and you're not asking anybody to do something that you haven't already walked out and lived out for an extended period of time. And not even that you're asking them, it just naturally flows from them because what you bring to the table is what you've been cultivating for years and years and years in the spaces that you've walked in. And so that's I think a powerful thing to hear because um you're right, being vulnerable, especially when you're first stepping into that, that is not easy, but if you can see somebody who's modeled what vulnerability looks like, it does help to not be as scary. I mean, I think it's still
Right.
scary. Being vulnerable is still scary to a degree, but when you see somebody else who's able to do it with a maturity and a perspective, it does help paint the picture of what that could look like. And so, yeah, just I think that's a I love what you were also sharing just about how you took time to really get to know who God was, like that time in the secret place, and a portion of that was just cultivating that in your story and in your soul, and, so I think what you shared is so tangible and practical in what other
Mm.
people can do who want to maybe learn to become more vulnerable or hold those spaces or just really let their being inform their doing.
Right.
Um,
And the
so
thing
it's a
about it is really need to understand that it's scary, but it's one of those scary things that you want to lean into, right? Like
mm,
we have that emotion of fear to protect us, but sometimes um what our mind is trying to protect us from is just because it's rare or it's unfamiliar. It's not because it's not safe or it's not better for you, right? And so, going having surgery is scary,
mhm,
but if you are in labor and your baby is breech, you have to have this surgery to so you and the baby can live. So it's scary because there's so much unknown and it's not something we do or see every day. And we've heard, scary stories about whatever, but this is your best chance. So in relationships that matter, especially our relationship with God, especially our relationship with our loved ones, we have to lean into the scary, because it's not because the fear is not because it's something that we need to protect ourselves from. The fear is because it's unfamiliar, and um and we need to learn to make it familiar. So that's what I've done, is I've made vulnerability familiar. So
Mm,
it's so for me, it's like, ooh, I look at people when I'm sitting with them, and I'm only imagining what it's gonna look like on the other side. I'm like,
mm,
ooh, we're about to have a session, right? Like after this, something amazing is gonna come out, because that's what my life has been. There's nothing that anyone has seen of me that is worth anything that didn't start from me having to first be vulnerable somewhere,
mm,
somehow. The relationship that I have with my children, or with my husband, that of course it's constant work, because I don't want people to, you hit things on different levels. I always reference like video games, how you can master one level, but then you have to go to another level, right? And when you start
mm,
that new level, you're at the ground level. You're not at level 1, but you're at level 2, position 0. And
mm,
that vulnerability feels like 0 on level 1, right? Because it's new again. So even in 17 and a half years of marriage, there's certain things that'll come up in my relationship with John that feels like I'm in grade school all over again when it comes to vulnerability. But what I know from my past is that I win on the other side of this. I
mm,
know that I graduate if I lean into this. And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's for my good, right? So, and even and my superpower, right, is that even if, like, well, what if it isn't for your good? What if it ends in divorce, or you finding something else out? Like all the scary things. Well, my
mm,
superpower, my blessed assurance beyond these natural relationships is God.
mm.
So I'm still
Wow.
good, right? I've got like
Mhm.
the Mac Daddy insurance policy, right? That
Yeah.
he'll never forsake me. So even in a situation where it's like, oh my gosh, Marie, I don't feel like I can do that. That's going to be extremely hard. Well, I choose to do it anyway, because I'm a challenge God on it.
Mm.
Let's see if you're
Yeah.
really if you're gonna forsake me now. I don't have anything to lose, right? But the
That's
Bible
good.
says that he's a man of his word. His word can't return void. It's not my reputation at stake here. It's God, right? It's his
Mm,
reputation at stake. Are you going to fail me now? That's what I'm gonna press in anyway. As fearful it may be, like, God, are you going to fail me now? And I know at the end of the day, no matter what it looks like, he has never failed.
mm.
In the
That's
stories that
good.
I've heard in my own life, even if it looked really, really bad. I mean, my husband and I, we've been homeless, we've lost everything. And even in the times where we were, sleeping in a house in one of the with no what did it have? There was something it didn't have. It had electricity, but it didn't have water. So at night we had the electricity in the house, but we didn't have any water. But when we were in the worst side of town, we had nothing except a storage unit with a few of our stuff, because the place we were staying at, we had to leave. Even in those moments, in my what I consider like my lowest point financially, for that particular example, he made all of that work out for our good.
Mm.
You
Wow.
know, so what do I
Y
have to lose at this point in my life? You know?
Right. No, I love it. What it reminds me of is, we can choose a safe, streamlined life. We can do our best to choose that. But if
Mhm.
we wanna level up and go deeper with the Lord and deeper in our relationships, that place of vulnerability and trusting in the Lord is key to really stepping out of the safety of
Right.
what we are trying for in life to experience the greater. And that's
Yeah,
something I can say hey, definitely still in process with that. But when you were sharing, it just reminded me of, sure, we can try to play it safe, play it safe, but really trusting in the Lord and living by faith and and asking God to show up what with what you were referencing, like really testing the Lord. Can you meet me in this moment? Can you help me to push through the fear for that through that vulnerability? Um,
right,
that's really just deepening our spiritual growth, our relationship with the Lord to really be at the kind of intimacy, at the level of intimacy that He really wants to be with us anyway, because He is that safety net, He is that safe place. But we won't get there if we're not willing to take those steps of vulnerability
right,
and faith and trust.
right.
So that was really powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and people have to you have to get to a crossroad. It's a point that you get to in life, and I've gotten it several times over because even as I've seen it in my life as I've, graduated, like when it was a beautiful story in us being homeless and then we ended up with our dream property, right? Like the best house. Like when in a real estate investor's dream, like your goal is to get the worst house in the best neighborhood. And at
Mhm.
the end of that journey of us sleeping in, a house with no running water and, whatever, being just homeless for it was about 90 days where, sometimes we would stay with friends or, but whatever, but never long enough for them to understand what's really going on. Right. Um, but it was at that end of that season that we got into the best real estate deal in our portfolio, right? So you look at that and you're like, okay, like that's pretty awesome. But when you get to a new problem that occurs, it completely in different areas, it completely humbles you. Like,
Mm.
it's like I don't even know. It's so hard to describe because it's like, didn't I pass this already? Didn't, like
Mm.
I was even talking, I have this prayer group. We're reading Draw the Circle by Mark Batterson together. We've been doing this prayer challenge, and you're more than welcome to join. Anyone listening, if you want to join the prayer group, you're more than it's just and it's kind of evolved, but not going into that. But anyways, I was talking to him the other day and I was like, sometimes I feel like it's almost like a toxic relationship between like God and I, like, God, why you keep putting me through these situations to prove that I trust you? I said I trust
Mm.
you. Why don't you just believe me? And I was kind of talking that out, just being raw. I feel like it's I was telling them it's giving toxic, right? But the thing is it toxic or is it that what you say out your mouth, he's testing to see if it's in your heart? Because that
Mm.
vulnerability, it's a constant thing. It's every day
Mm.
we have opportunities for our pride and our ego to rise up and for us to feel like, okay, yeah, I overcame homelessness. Now I'm in the house. We got the best house in our portfolio for real estate investors. Now ego and pride and self can get
Mm.
inflated, and if you're not committed to staying in a humble posture, right? If you're not continually getting these tests that will check you and make sure that you're postured at the feet of Jesus, then you can now graduated so many levels, but now you're right back to being untrusting and playing it safe like you're talking about. And
Mm.
that safety for me, I've always gotten to places even after wins that I realized my key was that I wasn't fulfilled. Yes, I was living.
Mm.
Yes, okay, you got the best deal, or you've seen success in this area, or you've seen success in that area. But it's like, yay, good. But that you can feel that there's a great. You can feel like
Mm.
there's more. And you have to get to a place whenever I've seen someone make a change, it's when they've gotten truly frustrated by
Mm.
the pain of underperformance or the excitement and pleasure that they dream up of really
Mm.
living life with God in color. And if I'm
Mm.
going out, Don, I want to go out living this life that God has called me, like in a God first way in color. I want to see Matthew 6:33 in color. Seek ye first the
Mm,
kingdom of God, and all things will be added unto you. I want to see that in color. And I know when I live my play it safe, and we're talking big quotation marks when we say play it safe, right? Because we know for sure that's an illusion in itself.
right.
But I know that it's black and white. I know that's a black and white screen because of my
Mm,
past, because of how I've seen him show up so colorfully in my life. I know that whenever I'm kind of trying to protect something, I know I need to completely turn my back on the door and fall in him, because there's a full color picture waiting for me somewhere that I want
mm,
to experience. And that's where I'm always holding space for people to get to. And that's something as human beings, like that's where, you know, talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy comes in, because it holds that safe space for you to decide, right? Are you going to have you experienced enough pain, or have a vision of the pleasure, of the beauty, of the grandeur that you can experience if you do the hard of pressing into, if you shut the fear up and press into that vulnerability?
mm. Wow. Oh my goodness. So many things to mind. I'm like trying to focus my brain because there's just so many facets of this that we could go into that are so powerful and so good. I'm so glad um, that the called forth audience is getting to hear this like lean in this deeper discussion, because I think it's really causes us to pause and start to process on a deeper level the priorities
Yeah.
that we have in our life, what we're really valuing. You know, the scripture, build
Mhm.
up for yourselves treasures in heaven, as you were sharing, came to mind. Because certainly we can live in the present and for the present and not really have that higher thought in mind. But what you're really talking about it is just going so deep in the Lord and at such a mature and intimate level. And I don't even know that I have all the language for like what's swirling in my head, but um I just think it causes us to process deeper with him beyond whatever circumstances we're facing, because you were talking about how you know, you were homeless for a period of time and then you found a house, and maybe initially in that moment you could have thought like, "Oh, I've made it." But
Right,
you went beyond that moment because you ultimately found that that wasn't fulfilling at
right,
that level, you know, because there was
right.
more, the Lord had more for you. So I think that's important to remember.
Yes, so
Uh,
important.
what I kind of want to make like a hard pivot just because join us next week for part 2 with Dr. Marie Cochran.